It's your Ghana
It's your girl Tash.
and you're listening to Two Chickpeas in a Podcast. We are proud to be partnering with the UK government in support of their campaign on honour-based abuse.
An initiative set up to educate and engage those who are most affected by these forms of abuse. We were in conversation with Natasha Rattu, and the Executive Director of Karma Nirvana, and this is what she had to say.
Thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited for you to be here. Really, maybe you two should be the two chickpeas because you were like the two Natashas.
We are.
Or it
Great
could just
name.
be called the two Natashas with just little me on the side. But yeah, we're really, really grateful that you're joining us today to talk about this really important subject, something that we feel really passionate about, and an issue that we can't believe is still happening in today's age.
Well, it's interesting as well that honor-based abuse is so prevalent in the UK as well, because I know in other countries, in India, Pakistan, a lot of these South Asian countries, it is such a way of life.
Or even the Middle East,
Yeah, Middle East, like where how people live, but actually to know that it's in the UK, kind of under our doorsteps as well, is really it's almost harrowing, but it's shocking, but not surprising. And I think, yeah, I've been excited. We've both been excited to talk about this, just in terms of we are so not educated on how much goes on in this country to do with that. I mean, we've seen films, television programs on these things, but I guess you guys doing a campaign, the UK government doing a campaign about honor-based abuse is so important. And I think this obviously raises awareness to the fact that a campaign like this is needed. So why has the UK government now chosen to do this campaign?
So the campaign is part of a global initiative called 16 Days of Activism, which is spotlighting violence against women and girls in all of its different formations. And honour-based abuse in particular is one area and one strand that the government look at underneath this umbrella of violence against women and girls. And I think the reason that's one of the reasons why they're doing it at this moment in time, but it's also a really hidden form of abuse underneath that umbrella. It's really not spoken about very widely in terms of the communities upon which it's happening. So this campaign is really, really important to spotlight it in a week where there's lots of proactive things going on to highlight this issue just more broadly.
Yeah. And what about yourself and your work with Karma Nirvana? Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and the work that Karma Nirvana carry out?
Yeah, so Karma Nirvana have been around for 31 years, and I think that shows that, these issues have been around for longer than that, but, for 31 years we've been around. We deliver a helpline that's commissioned by the Home Office, so the only national helpline for victims of honour-based abuse, supporting men and women. We do lots of different things in terms of training and educating people who have a duty to protect and safeguard, so police officers, social workers, teachers. We do lots of campaigning work, so we're currently campaigning to try and get a legal definition to clarify what honour-based abuse is, because there are so many misunderstandings about what people understand it to be and actually what it is. So we're campaigning for that at the moment. But we also work really closely with a lot of families that have lost a loved one to a domestic homicide, where honour has been either a motivation behind it or it's been a barrier for that person to get help. And I think what's really evident is that there is so much more that needs to be done in so many different spaces, whether it's training or changing the law or making sure that people get the right support, that we're just always so stretched with all of the work that we do. But the helpline is our core part of our work, in terms of the frontline work of supporting people that are going through this day in, day out.
And so honor-based abuse, as you said, it's an umbrella, right? But what kind of forms of abuse come underneath that?
Yeah, so essentially, in all cases of honour based abuse, there are really strong components of control, because most of the people that we support live their life by having expectations that are put upon them, and they're really different from person to person, family to family, even community to community. But we hear things like, my family, expect that I have to marry somebody who looks like this or is of this particular religious background, or my family expect me to study and pursue this and I don't have any other options. So essentially there's a lot of control that can happen within honor-based abuse. So if we kind of link that to criminal offences, coercive control is probably the closest offence that we see happening quite often. And actually, the latest data release from the Home Office showed that that was the most recorded crime type. Coercive control was for honour-based abuse. But we also see lots of other things like, for example, people who experience forced marriage, who are being pressured and coerced to marry someone that they don't want to, and then people within those marriages experiencing abuse from their in-laws, from their extended family, and all of those sorts of pressures. So there's lots of different things that can happen. There's not kind of one set thing in particular. And I think that's really important to clarify, because I think sometimes people think you can only be going through a forced marriage or only be experiencing FGM, another crime that comes underneath this umbrella. But actually, there's lots of different things that a person could be experiencing, very much linked to control of their life.
And coming back to the campaign, so what do we is the campaign hoping to achieve? I mean, I know us having this conversation today is going to raise so much awareness and get a conversation rolling, but what is the bigger picture with the campaign? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So I know that the campaign aims to educate, to raise awareness, but also to reach people that are affected by these issues, because quite often people who go through honour-based abuse experience multiple perpetrators, so more than one perpetrator, and often it's not just a partner or an ex-partner, it can include their family, wider family, extended family, whether in this country or abroad. So people often feel quite isolated in their experience, and in their ability to reach out and get help. So the campaign also wants to talk to people who are affected by this, to know that actually help is available and that you're not alone, and getting that word out as far and wide as possible.
As two South Asian women, three, here we are. This is really lovely that we're having this conversation and we are raising awareness to talk about honor-based abuse. However, there are so many people that find it shameful, find it hard. We don't talk about our feelings. We don't feel like we can even bring it up. It's almost
Or that we're allowed to even have a voice,
mm,
let alone in regard to this matter, but just in general. Why do you think it is so difficult for South Asian women in particular, as we are all
mm,
South Asian women? Like, what's your take on why we
mm,
find it so hard to speak openly about honor-based abuse? Because it is still, I think maybe for us, maybe we think it's like an archaic like practice. We would hope living here in the UK or in Western world, like that practice isn't taking place, and
mm,
we're so wrong about
mm.
that. But what's your take, or what's your feeling as to why women struggle to talk openly about this form of abuse?
I think there's a huge fear around judgment and perception and reputation, and how you're perceived. And if you're not upholding these expectations, how will you then be received in the community? Or, quite often people who call us feel like actually they're the perpetrator. They feel like they're bad for going against their family, going against the expectations of what the family have put upon them. And all they want to do is just actually make choices for their own life. And they feel bad about doing that. So I think there is so much judgment, stigma, and shame that wraps around, as a barrier, that makes it just so difficult for people to feel open to share. And I think everybody at some point, in their experience, particularly as women, um, would have felt, actually I can't talk about that, or I can't do that, because how is that going to be received, or what will people think? That's always the big worry, like what's so and so going to think? And that definitely makes it a lot more difficult. And I think that kind of leads on to the point of it being so important to remove the shame and the stigma, because actually the shame and the stigma shouldn't be for the people that are being abused. It should be for the people that are doing the abusing. we need to reverse that role. We need to be talking about it more openly and having those really honest conversations, because ultimately, unless we do that, this is going to keep manifesting and breeding within communities, and it's never going to get any better.
Yeah, and this idea of, I suppose, like obedience, like structure, form that's sort of been put onto women when it comes to our household, and also just the expectation that you have to abide, you have to comply, and men have a different freedom in that regard. What, yeah, is from your work and that you've been carrying out for the last 30 plus years, do you think that that notion of obedience of women is slowly changing, or is it still a pressing issue?
I think there's obedience, but then I think there's also that idea around, your purity, like how pure are you perceived, to not have relationships before marriage or not to have sex before marriage. And you're judged by all these standards and all these things that are there. And I think on top of that, I think sadly, you're made to feel like you're a good girl if you cook, if you clean, if you're domesticated, if you do X, Y, and Z, and then there are labels for you if you don't do all those things. And actually, a lot of this is rooted in misogyny, because if you think about men and boys, they don't have those same levels of expectations around, in fact, if they do those things, they're really praised for it. Whereas for women and girls, it's kind of like, well, it's what you're meant to do anyway, and you're judged if you don't do it. Whereas men and boys don't necessarily have those same sorts of barriers. Like for example, like prime example, and this is kind of work aside, you think about your own families. Who is cooking? Who is eating first? Who is cleaning up? Who is taking up the majority of the domestic chores in the house? If there's a disparity in that, well, we're part of the problem if we're not challenging that narrative. That's not to say that, I enjoy cooking, so, I'm not oppressed by that. But if it's an expectation that you have to do it because you're a woman, that's quite a different thing. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing these micro expectations that actually aren't being challenged on a day-to-day basis. I mean, I've got two young boys, and in my line of work that I do, it's so important for me to make sure that they don't be part of the problem in the future when they do grow older, that they're domesticated, that they can do all the things that perhaps have been expected for their female counterpart cousins, or, for their mom, or all the women in their society. So I think it's about challenging that, because if we're not challenging that, we're also part of the problem. And even though it's not abusive, it's feeding into this abusive narrative. So that's why it's important to challenge it at every level that we can.
1000%. And I'm sure your boys are learning to grow to be allies towards women as well, to speak up for them, for women who feel like they can't use their voice to defend themselves. And even coming back to this idea of purity, sort of women sort of being shamed for having relationships before marriage and things like that. But actually, a misogynistic and even a narcissistic male will use any experience you have to shame you. It's not like you could do any right thing. Sometimes they would shame you for not having sort of relationships before marriage. Like, what do you know? What have you experienced of the world, sort of thing. So anything can be used against you. I suppose in that regard, and I suppose I'm making that point for anyone listening, to say there's no right way to be in a marriage that's abusive, because abuse is wrong, full stop. There's no right way to go around it.
Yeah, absolutely.
But talking about that, I mean, you've mentioned that there's all the things under the umbrella of honor-based abuse, but let's talk about it in a little bit more detail. So, firstly, the like we're saying about purity. I mean, what deems a woman to be pure before marriage? Um, the virginity testing, the forced marriages, the FGM. Let's go into detail about that. So, first of all, forced marriages, it's something that I think we all know that happens still today. And what really is a forced marriage?
So a forced marriage, really important to set out, is different to an arranged marriage. But many people will talk about having an arranged marriage that they don't want, and that is technically a forced marriage. So I'll do it in reverse. An arranged marriage is a marriage in which you're consenting, you're happy for your family typically to find you somebody to meet, and you have the free will and choice to say yes or no. It's, you know, it lies with you. There's no pressure or duress in that decision making at all. Whereas a forced marriage is one in which it may have started as an arranged marriage, but actually, you know, you're now meeting suitor number 3, 4, or 5, and you feel that your biological clock is ticking, your family are expecting you to get married, and you know, it's not so easy to say no. So there is some subtleties to the duress and the pressure that can be there. And then the other end of the spectrum and at the extremity, and this is what we tend to see most in the media, but this doesn't happen as often, is the physical force, where you see somebody physically being forced. In fact, the middle example that I gave is what we see happen quite often, and where we get people who contact our helpline who say, well, it's an arranged marriage, like I'm happy to get married, but I'm just struggling to say no here. Like I don't feel like I can say no. I'm going to disappoint my mom, my dad, you know, my grandma's old, all of these sort of things. And the clearest thing that you can ask somebody is, are you able to say no without, you know, pressure? Like, do you feel you can say no? And everybody would be fine with that. And if your answer is, well, actually I can't, then you've got what is starting out to then be a forced marriage. So they are very different to arranged marriages, but it's just about being clear that there is this bit of a grey area that a lot of people don't necessarily recognise. And if you've got a victim who's going through this, going to the police and saying it's an arranged marriage, and they don't understand the context, they may think it's okay because it's an arranged marriage. So the subtext and the context is also so important to understanding what's really going on.
Such a stark difference between arranged marriages and forced marriages, but something that I found really bemusing to even think of as a concept is virginity testing. Um, that is, I don't understand why that would even be a thing. Like, what is? I mean, it kind of sounds self-explanatory, but I'm like, how could you possibly prove that? I don't understand.
So, first and foremost, like scientifically, medically, it's impossible to check if somebody is a virgin. Like, you just medically cannot do it.
Yeah.
Yet, up until 2022, there were surgeries on Harley Street clinics that were offering this service of checking your virginity. And it comes back to this notion of sexual purity. It's about your worth, like your worth is only as good as your hymen is intact. So the procedure in itself is a procedure where a woman is violated and checked to see whether her hymen is intact or not, which actually, as I've said, doesn't prove that you're a virgin, because your hymen can break in so many different ways, through PE, through sports, through horse riding, gymnastics. So it's just not an indicator. And then what we were seeing prior to the law coming in was you know, your typically family, or sometimes the prospective family of the spouse that you were going to marry, would want to see the certificate that proves that you are a virgin, and you get a certificate to say that, oh look, she is, and it makes you just somehow more desirable and wanted. So that's the process in itself. And then where women were not deemed to be virgins, there's another procedure that they could then have called hymenoplasty, which is where you surgically sew the hymen so it looks like it's intact. Which actually, for women that have that, only 50% then go on to bleed, because that's an expectation that the first time you consummate your marriage, you will bleed. So it's all about a woman's worth being based upon whether her hymen is intact or not. And as I've said, it's incredibly evasive. The surgical procedure of hymenoplasty has its complications, and there is no medical reason why you would ever need to have that done. In fact, we did a lot of work with the Royal College of Gynecology and obstetricians, and it was really a learning journey for us around the science around your body, because you don't really learn about this at school, which again I think is something really critical, that we should be learning about our bodies and not just certain elements of our bodies. So actually there's no reason why you would ever need to have the procedure. In fact, if you had a hymen that wasn't perforated, you would have to get it perforated to have a menstrual cycle. So there's no reason medically why you would ever need that procedure. Yet the NHS were providing this to women. And it's astonishing that actually we've had people since the law changed, who, GP surgeries, I should actually clarify, that have contacted us since to say we've got someone that's come in that's asking for this and not realizing that the law has changed, citing that, you know, they're worried about what will happen if they're found to not be a virgin. So yeah, really, really horrific, and it's you know, it's happening. It's not only happening in clinics, but sometimes there'll be somebody in the community that will come and check whether someone is a virgin or not. But like I said, there's no way that you can possibly check for that. It's just impossible.
Yeah, and I can only imagine how that would make someone even more vulnerable to this form of abuse, isn't it? By claiming that some sort of like religious figure or like auntie or someone, you know, whoever they think is qualified to do this, to do that to yourself. That's what I was thinking anyway. And even as you were talking, like my stomach was literally squirming. Like I'm sure you saw it all over my face. I just was like, how was this ever a concept? And it's also just like, why are women like subject to all of this crazy um irrational abuse as well? And I can only imagine, I mean, all I kept thinking of, like, poor women who may have faced this is, what does that do to you psychologically? What does that do for your mental health? Like, you know, my stomach's just squirming hearing about it. Like I can't even imagine having gone through the experience and
Yeah.
being the same person afterwards, I
Well,
suppose.
we had a person who contacted our helpline who was a victim of rape, and she never felt able to report that because of this perception that she would then not be a virgin. And she felt like having this virginity test was walking into her own funeral, because nobody knew that she had been raped by a family member. And you know, it therefore really cloaks people's ability to report abuse where it's happening, because the blame is put on them, not on the abuser. So there's so many complexities and layers to it, and it's just really, really sad that all of this is put on a female, down to being a woman, because let's be honest, men don't have these same sorts of challenges or expectations put on them.
No, not at all. It literally boils my blood to think about this experience having happened for so many years, but even still so today, maybe even to women younger than us right now.
Yeah.
It's making me feel, yeah,
I
I'm
mean,
like
for like,
speechless.
yeah, I mean, virginity testing is just it's
Mm,
nuts that it even happens. And I mean, I know that
mm.
you said it's illegal and rightly so, but you know, what are the implications of that? Like, if someone is to come in and ask for virginity testing, are there like,
Is there anything in place to prevent these things from
mm,
taking place in the first place?
So it is a crime. So surgical clinics, you know, they cannot provide the service anymore, which they used to provide. Um, there is guidance that's in place, legal government guidance in place to alert people to the concerns around what they should do if somebody wants to come forward, because it's clearly a safeguarding red flag if you've got someone coming to your clinic and asking for this, about what environment they're living in and what's going on for them at home. We haven't had any criminal offences pursued as of yet. I think because of the nature of what's happening to a person, there's a lot of secrecy and a lot of shame around it. People are deliberately very secretive about this even happening in the first place. So I think it is really undetected. But what we hope with the law is that we can bring about a whole new level of education, because there are girls that seem to think that actually you can, you know, check if you're a virgin or not, and actually just educating them to know that that's just not possible, and educating the community to know that's just not possible. It's you know, this whole idea of virginity is a man-made concept. You know, it's not, it's just not true. It's been made by man to control women, to control their bodies, to control what they do. So it's about challenging the communities, it's about challenging the people that believe this and educating people. I mean, in America, they have these virginity balls where you're praised for being a virgin, and the rapper, I think was it T.I.? I think he used to get his daughter to have a virginity test every year to check she was still a virgin. And there are people that glorify this notion of being a virgin, and it's just, yeah, absolutely horrific. So it's about challenging those ideas, and that's what the law, I think, will enable us to do beyond prosecuting and punishing people.
Mm. Sorry, my stink face is going to be on the entirety of this recording. Like everything I'm finding out and learning, I'm like, can't listen to no rappers' music ever again, man. They're all crazy. Can't believe that. Is there anything like women can do to resist undergoing virginity testing? Because I know, like, when I go to like pubs and things like that, like in the bathroom, they're like, "Oh, ask for Angela, or ask for this person at the bar if you feel like you're in trouble."
Mm.
Is there anything in that regard placed for women to resist undergoing
um
virginity testing?
I mean, ultimately, if it's happening in an institution, in a an establishment, a clinic, it shouldn't be happening, and that person at the reception or the clinician should be live to, okay, I need to do something about this. Whether that's happening in practice or not is a whole another idea. Um, but there isn't a scheme like you could ask for Angela and let people know that you needed help. But actually asking for the procedure in itself should be that red
No red
flag that
flag.
goes up.
Yeah, well, I hope so. And I hope any women listening out here just continue to talk and educate with each other, educate one another, sorry, around your rights. Like no one has the right to look into that. No parent, no uncle, no auntie, no future in-law, no one. Your body's yours, no one else's. Can't believe like how heavy like some of the things we're talking about, but it's so important. Like I can't believe how much I'm learning today. I
Mhm.
mean, I have some understanding of the concept of honor killings. I don't know, I can't remember the name of the film. It's really going to bug me, but there was a film with Janvi Kapoor and Ishan Khatter that came out about honor killings. So I mean, I've learned, I suppose, a little bit through film and TV where it has been sort of spoken about, but not often enough at all. So, do you mind explaining
Mm.
the conception of honor killings in South Asian communities?
Yeah, so in the UK, statistically, there are 12 to 15 honour killings that take place every year. And an honour killing is a murder that's been motivated by a perpetrator who feels that they have the right to punish somebody because they've brought shame or dishonour. So we deal with these, really regularly. I mean, even that there is speculation about the Harshit Umbrella case and dowry being part of the reason of why there was domestic abuse. So there'll be lots of cases where there is speculation where actually it hasn't been founded. But last year we saw the murder trial for an uncle who had murdered his daughter, his niece, sorry, in Bradford, called Samaya Begum, who had a forced marriage protection order in place. And again, Banaz Mahmood, Shafilia Ahmed, there are so many girls who have been murdered at the hands of parents, uncles, aunts, brothers, typically. Um, and, I mean, ultimately, it's a domestic homicide, and I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast that we support a lot of families that are bereaved and grieving through this loss and the ripple effect that it has. So yeah, so these do happen in the UK. I would say 12 to 15 is probably an underestimate. I think then it's not always picked up that there has been an honour dynamic or motive. Like in Samaya's case, for example, really clear honour dynamic, but the judge did say in the judgment that he couldn't call it an honour killing because the prosecution hadn't alluded to any evidence which pointed towards that. And actually, you can't blame him because the prosecution hadn't. And sadly, sometimes prosecutors get a bit concerned about talking about honor-based abuse because they don't want to confuse a jury about what it is and risk an acquittal. But then I think that really goes to the heart of the need to educate everybody about this. That's so vitally important. Otherwise, this is still going to be underneath a cloak of secrecy, and it's going to enable it just to keep perpetuating, generation after generation if we don't talk about it.
Yeah, and just even thinking about you speaking about the prosecutors and maybe why they won't call something an honor-based killing. I mean, a killing's a killing, like regardless of it, of what category it comes under. It's the category of wrong, and awful and devastating. So, yeah, so much more needs to go into education, especially in male-dominated industries like law, like being a judge, like being in government. They're still very male led, and yeah, just more commendments to people like yourself and Karma Nirvana for raising awareness. So could you bring my attention to what sort of things would trigger an honor based killing? I mean, yeah, you've spoken a little bit about it, but what are some of the reasons people say, like, why they feel like they could go and kill their family member for that?
So, in the case of Shafilia Ahmed, and we talk about Shafilia, and we have a day of memory on her birthday, which is the 14th of July every year, to honour her memory, because often people killed in honour killings are forgotten because their family aren't doing anything to raise their profile or remember them. But for Shafilia, she was perceived as being too Western, and I really hate that term Western because she was just being a normal teenage girl, listening to music, having friends, just doing very normal teenage things. Banaz Mahmood was murdered by members of her family because she was seen kissing a boy at a London tube station. Um, Samaya had simply contacted police and sought to get help to protect herself and her siblings from forced marriage. So it's really subjective as to what can trigger another case. And again, we're supporting a family where their mother was murdered by their father, 7 children left behind. The eldest was 20 at the time, she's 24. The youngest is 10, was 6 at the time. And the father's justification for murder was that the eldest daughter, Ria, was so disobedient. She was so, she had a black boyfriend. She did things that the dad felt justified his actions for murdering their mum. So it makes no sense. It absolutely makes no sense because, like you say, it's wrong, it's murder. But these are the things that perpetrators will try to say to justify their actions. Another
That makes no sense. And again, is it, sorry to even cut you off, but is it because this is a crime that's happened to a woman opposed to a male? Like, would that be a very different conversation? Because I don't understand how a prosecutor could even try and justify any of the actions when the reasons behind this so-called like honor killing are subjective in themselves. It's not a law anywhere. It's complete subjection. Sorry, I'm getting so passionate and enraged, but I don't understand. Like, is this only because the victim is a woman, essentially?
I mean, ultimately, yes. I mean, there are 2 women that die every week at the hands of domestic abuse. So women are dying, often in a way that's preventable because so in the UK, well, in England and Wales, because Scotland don't have this, we have domestic homicide reviews where we review a domestic homicide after it's happened, and we look at whether we can learn lessons so we can prevent future deaths. Now, the rate at which women are dying at the hands of domestic abuse isn't slowing down. It's been very, very consistent. And we're currently sat in 4 review panels, and it's really enraging that a lot of the recommendations of what we need to do better are coming up in every review years down the line. It's like, okay, well, we said that 2 years ago when that person died, and we're saying it again. So nothing seems to be changing. So yeah, just to kind of go back to your question, it is really enraging, and it is happening to women disproportionately, and there is so much more that needs to be done. We're hopeful with the new government. We've got a fantastic
Mm.
minister um, for this portfolio area who has worked in the sector herself and really understands and gets the issues. So I think it gives us hope for change. I think that's all we can be, because she does really get it. And, you know, it's an opportunity, I think, for us to try and make sure that we prevent these deaths from happening and that we get that
Mm.
education out there for the next generation, really, really critically.
Following on what you've just said, I suppose two questions. Is there anything we as a South Asian community, men and women, could be doing? I'm just thinking of like how like pressure on a woman or maybe gossiping and things like that lead to sort of pressure
Mm.
to either commit an honor killing or to, incite forced marriage or some sort of virginity testing or something. Um, is there something more we could be doing as a community to prevent this?
Absolutely. I mean, in these communities where there is honor-based abuse, it very much is on the basis of what other people are going to think. So if you are gossiping, if you are contributing to that conversation, you're inciting the harm. I mean, that doesn't take away from what the perpetrator ultimately does, but you are an enabler and you're part of the problem. I think fundamentally is a key message to put out there. So I think it's about the community challenging these harmful ideas that exist in our society. Don't be part of the problem, be part of the solution, be part of actually making a difference for the next generation, because if you're not, then these issues are going to continue in your child's
Mhm,
lifetime, in your grandchild's lifetime. Like, where does it stop? You could be part
mhm.
of making this stop.
And is there any like legal protections for, like, you've mentioned a young person sort of came forward to the police and said, I'm really worried me and my siblings are at risk of forced marriage. But, you know, is there any legal protections around women to prevent that happening? Is there something that can be done to sort of separate them from their family before it's too late? Um,
Yeah, so for forced marriage, there are forced marriage protection orders and there are FGM protection orders too, which very much operate like civil injunctions, like a non molestation order. So you could get an order if you were concerned that your family might take you out of the country and force you to marry, or even in this country and get you married. You can get a civil order to prevent that from happening. Um, so we support people, we tend to support local authorities quite often where a concern has come via a child, either through school or through a friend, and they want to protect that child from forced marriage. Usually there is an international element where they're worried about them being taken out of the country, so the order can stop their parents from taking them out or confiscate passports or put measures into place just to keep them safe from a forced marriage.
I can't. Well, sorry. I'm just in utter shock and disbelief in some of the things I'm hearing. I suppose you're saying there's like protections against, women, if with forced marriages and things like that. But in your opinion, what else do you think needs to happen legally to further protect women?
I think it fundamentally comes down to creating a society where these ideas aren't tolerated. I think there's so much tolerance and so much just expectation that's put on women and girls generally. And then if you break that down to communities where there is a concern about honour and reputation and what other people think, it puts a whole new layer on top of a layer that just exists for women and girls just more generally. So I think we need to develop and create an intolerance to these ideas
Mm.
that women are the subject to our control, that women should do this or women should do that. That's the first thing that we need to do, because I suppose when we're putting in legislation, that's just dealing with it at that critical crisis point.
Mhm.
Things have escalated and they've got to a place where, you know, prevention's not possible. It's happening in the here and now. So I think at the heart of it is education. It's educating not just our communities, but our next generation of children. It's making sure that we have this deep intolerance to harmful notions that promote abuse towards women and girls. there's so many subtleties to it. I suppose, you know, there might be things that are happening around you that may not escalate to physical abuse. And I think that's when we're talking about abuse, we're talking about abuse often in a physical way, but also psychologically, it's how it's making you feel. Do you feel like you're being controlled by other people's ideas around how you should live your life and how you should behave? And to an extent, you know, we all have aspirations for our children and things that we want them to do. However, that shouldn't result in, if they don't uphold those beliefs and expectations that you have for them, that you end up causing them harm, whether it's physical harm or psychological harm, because ultimately that is control. That's what it's, you know, it's about. So I think for a person who might be going through this, I think it's about them recognizing whether they feel that they're able to make decisions for themselves, and if they don't uphold expectations around them, will they be harmed, will they be hurt as a consequence of that? So I think that's the subtlety to it. And I think also, like, if you're not sure about whether this is honor based abuse, or abuse, just more generally, just reach out and talk to a professional. We have a national helpline that's free and confidential, that somebody could talk through anonymously if they wanted, to, you know, talk through their circumstance, and we could support them on that.
Yeah, that'd be great. And we'll keep coming back to the community and what more we could be doing to support victims and at the risk of honor-based violence, and preventing these tragedies. But I mean, you've mentioned some, but do you think it's getting harder to sort of educate and have these conversations when, we were talking about the law earlier, but sometimes, laws are put against women to not protect them. I'm thinking of Roe versus Wade in America, and how women don't even have the right to have, like, an abortion. Something on that's another right of theirs that's been taken away, and a decision sort of being made for them. So do you find with, like, political things like this and the work that you carry out, your job, and even our job as just women and allies to other women, is getting harder, because we could have these conversations here, and something on a global level is happening
Mm,
like that. is
mm.
is that is that a challenge you come across in your work?
I mean, yeah, it is, because I think all of this feeds into your media, and it feeds into what your people are, you know, your young people are seeing and witnessing and recognizing. So it does feed into that narrative. And I think also this idea that women's bodies can be controlled. I mean, even in this country, there was a bit of a debate about whether women should be allowed to have telemedicine abortion. So over COVID times, when women couldn't go out to clinics to get medication to have a termination, there was a provision put in place in law so that women could get this over the phone, and then it could be posted to them. And then there was a whole debate about whether this should continue post COVID. And we were really supportive of it continuing post COVID, because for the communities that we serve, even going out to these clinics, again, if you're seen, reputation, shame.
Yeah.
And it was so interesting to see, you know, the number of people that came out to debate on this. A lot of old white men having views on what should happen to a woman's body. And I'm just saying, there were white men in the majority that were involved in this debate and discussion. And it's like, you don't have, you know, a uterus. You don't have the ability to make decisions about what a woman should or shouldn't be able to do with the body. And there were no harmful consequences to this law. If anything, it was really, really helpful, because it meant that women could access the telemedicine abortion medication a lot quicker. It was less traumatic to have a termination, because interestingly, for women who there was some statistics over COVID that we were doing a piece of work with a abortion care provider, and they recognised that they had a real surge in victims of honour-based abuse accessing their service, so a 35% increase over COVID, and that the majority of women were late presentations, so they were a lot later on in their pregnancy, which requires a surgical procedure, and you have to be away for a few days in order to have this procedure. So actually, the telemedicine abortion, if that meant access was quicker, then it meant that it was going to be less traumatic for a woman who's made a choice for her body to then do what she needs to do for her body. And just an example of how, you know, women's bodies are being policed in America here. You know, we see these conversations happening all the time. And often it's not the women that are at the heart of making these decisions for their own body, which is just so sad.
Yeah, I suppose I brought that up because I was just thinking like what a challenge might be in us sort of trying to spread the word on this and how to argue with mainly men. Like I'm not, not, I'm sure there are some women as well who'd struggle to understand the concept of this as well. But yeah, like a lot of men who think they somehow have the logic and the backup and the evidence. And sadly, that evidence is out there when we have things like Roe versus Wade in America and the other situations you mentioned that people face here in the UK. Um, so what coming back to Karma Nirvana, I mean, what role does Karma Nirvana play in the community with, and do you have any interactions with community leaders or religious leaders in addressing these situations? Because I suppose a lot of people will always fall back onto religion as a reason or a justification behind an honor killing or some honor based abuse.
It's been difficult because the community leaders and often the religious leaders don't want to talk about this because it feels so taboo to talk about. And actually, they would be far more powerful in addressing their communities if they went out into their communities to talk about this. But the reality is, the majority don't want to do that. So it's really difficult for us to engage with them. Um, but we'd really encourage the community leaders and the religious leaders to be having those conversations, because I think if people were hearing it from people from within the community, they would feel more enabled to come forward and get help and talk and speak up. But sadly, a lot of these community leaders are gatekeepers rather than gate openers. They don't enable the dialogue and the conversation, and don't represent, people that are going through this in their community, which is really sad because, when you appoint yourself to be in a position like that, surely one of protection and safeguard and safety, is a responsibility that you should have. That just doesn't happen.
Is there a campaign or some form of uh, activism sort of taking place to have this kind of education rolled out in all schools across the UK? Because I can imagine some schools saying like, no, we don't want to teach this in PSHE, or some parents even sort of writing in like, how can my child be learning or talking about this at school? But I think,
Mm.
it's it should be part of staple education, because it's on looking how to treat one another, how to stand up for one another. um does Karma Nirvana work with schools? Is this something that can be taught and learned in schools?
Definitely. I mean, we've actually been in a school this week, and it's absolutely possible, and it is part of PHSE in terms of talking about healthy relationships, what is healthy and what is not. Um, in terms of how that's working, it's difficult to monitor and kind of control that because to an extent that's down to the school. But where we're invited to go and talk to schools, we always take up the opportunity, recognising the role that they have to play, in terms of the next generation. And as teachers, even if it's not to the students directly, we do lots with teachers as well via the helpline. So we're a resource for, them supporting people who they might identify in their school.
And where can people that have been affected by honor-based abuse or want to learn more about it, where can they come to learn more about this campaign and the work that you carry out?
Yeah, so they can go to our website, which is karmanirvana.org.uk, and find out more information about us and the work that we're doing, and all the things that we've been involved in. I, I had mentioned before we came into this podcast that we were part of a documentary called The Push, which featured the murder trial of Fozia Javid. Um, watch that. That's now had 6 million views globally. It's really, really helped people to recognise what honour-based abuse and domestic abuse can look like. We've had people who have watched it and realised that actually this is something that they're going through. So I think just our website would probably be a really good starting point to see what is out there and what support is available. We have an incredible survivor ambassador panel, which is made up of people that have lived experiences of honour-based abuse, and their stories are on our website too. So yeah, the website I think would be the place to point people to.
And what about with the campaign itself? Is that separate? Is that a separate place that they can go and look for more information about?
Yeah, there is information on our website about the campaign too.
Yeah.
So it'll be in our news feed on our website.
So I honestly thought I had some form of like great understanding around honor-based abuse, honor killings. Virginity testing was something that was like a new conception to me, but I just thought like, oh, like I have basic information on this. Like I could talk about this. I have learned so much from you
Me too.
today. And it's truly been an education, and it's just boiled my blood enough to want to carry on like having these conversations and raising further awareness about this. So thank you so much for your time, because it has just given me a wealth of knowledge, and I hope to try and replicate some of the great work that Karma Nirvana and yourself do. So thank you so much.
Oh no, thank you for having me on.
Yeah, definitely. And honestly, like, it goes without saying that even though we're educated, there's so many people outside of this door right now who still don't have the understanding, men, women, people going through it themselves. So we hope that, for anyone who's listening, you get some sort of education, some, confidence that you're not alone, that there are resources out there that you can definitely find some sort of comfort in and reach out to get help. And I think even for us, like these conversations are so important to us, because as two sisters in the South Asian community, yourselves who are doing this great work with Karma Nirvana, I think conversations like these are just so monumental, because again, like, we don't have the understanding, the education, like we've just learned so much. And yeah, I hope that we can do more, more episodes, and really grasp these campaigns and raise the awareness that they completely deserve. So yeah, again, thank you guys at Karma Nirvana, and yourself Natasha, for chatting to us.
But until the next episode, next time, it's been your girl Nikita.
It's been your girl Tash.
And Natasha.
And you've been listening to Two Chickpeas in a podcast.